Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session. This side event will focus on the unveiling of the Adaptation Gap Report. And if you look at the title, I think it speaks for itself. Underfinanced, underprepared. There's inadequate investment and planning on climate adaptation, which leaves the world exposed. My name is Edith Ofwana-Adera. I'm a regional principal officer with the African Development Bank and a member of the steering committee of the Adaptation Gap Report. Today's event will have two segments. We'll have a high-level segment, and then we'll go into a panel discussion. And the panel discussion will draw insights from the report to discuss on the importance of increasing adaptation effectiveness while assessing global progress on adaptation and looking at efforts to reduce loss and damage and evaluate the current adaptation finance gaps. Welcome, and I'd like to now move into the high-level segment, and it's my pleasure to welcome Ms. Inga Anderson. Please come to the podium. You're most welcome. Thank you. I'd like to give you a copy of the report.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you to you for your leadership and for being on the committee and for all that you do.
Thank you.
And for being from Kenya, which is our home.
Thank you.
Listen, thank you very much and good morning. And we're really honored that Simon, my colleague, could join. We know that he has an insane schedule. So I was telling my colleagues, be ready that he may not be able to make it. So it's super special that you are here, Simon. But thank you. I think the picture says it all. Underprepared, underfinanced. I want to pay tribute to my colleague Henry Neufeld, who has been the editor of this piece, not only this year, but previously too. But really what this report says is that the world is really exposed and that the climate extreme are hammering us down. And that we are living this. So, I mean, for the last 4 years, we have lived in East Africa in an extreme drought. In a country that I call home right now, Kenya, we saw 1.5 million heads of cattle die in the northern part of the country. And we saw this before our very eyes, and now the country that we call home is being socked by flooding. So these extremes from one end to the other that we're living that we haven't seen before, but we've seen flooding in China and Europe, extreme heat, of course, record temperatures, and on it goes. And as the emissions gap report will tell us, you know, we are heading, based on the NDCs, to 2.9 degrees in 2100. So we now need to adapt, but the longer we delay, the higher the bill. And nature will keep sending us these invoices irrespective, and nature will not stop, even if we stop. If COVID stops us, or war and conflict stops us, you know, the invoices will still come, and they come in the form of ever greater climate impact. And the adaptation gap is just yawning. We are seeing that and the report bears this out, between 200 to 350 billion a year, give and take. And it's about 50% higher than what we previously measured. So the reality is that we have forgotten the promise that we made to each other in Glasgow. In Glasgow, we said that we were going to double adaptation finance by 2025, and surely we should be well on the way towards that now, but we are not. And even if we were, it would just be doubling from 20 billion to 40 billion, which is a drop in the ocean, when we know that we need to hit between 200 and 350, give and take, billion. And so the public and the multilateral finance was 21 billion in 2021, and that is down 15% from 2020. So it's going in the wrong direction, and the gap is becoming even bigger. And I mentioned Kenya's drought for a reason, because before the drought, 1.5 million school children were getting school feeding every day in Kenya. But as the drought killed off cattle, families were further impoverished. They couldn't sell milk products, they didn't have calves to sell, etc. And so the school feeding program went from 1.5 million to 4 million kids. Now, where's that money come from? That's a climate impact. Who's going to pay for it? And Kenya is therefore having to borrow to ensure that these things can be covered. But this is not considered climate adaptation finance when you feed another 2.5 million school kids. But yet, it bears a cost on the government burden. And these countries are already in heavy debt. And so the reality is that indebtedness is a real issue and should be considered, as Mia Motley and many others have expressed, as part of a reform thinking of the international financing institutions and the global financial system, because clearly this cannot go on. Now, the good news is that 85% of countries have an adaptation plan in place, 25% have legal instruments requiring governments to plan for adaptation, and 69% have an admin body that kind of is organizing all of this. But the truth is also that we are falling short on some critical areas. Yesterday was Gender Day, something I found a little ironic because every day is surely Gender Day for half of the world's population, but be that as it may, only 2% of international public finance for adaptation is gender responsive. And you know that in Article 9, I think I'm looking at Simon to correct me here, we say that adaptation measures have to be gender responsive, but they are not. 2% are. And so we have a long way to journey. 7 ways to bridge the adaptation finance gap, and we will hear more about that from Henry. Clearly, international public finance, yes, but that will not be the be it and end all. Domestic smart planning and expenditure on adaptation, and of course, private sector finance. These have, and community-led activities are often the very strongest. There are sources and resources available, but it is vastly inadequate. And so the story around what is happening now on loss and damage, the more we dilly-dally and climate procrastinate on the issue of on mitigation, the higher the bill for adaptation will be, and the higher the bill for loss and damage will be. So I'm really, really impressed with what the President, as well as our fearless leader, Simon Steele, have managed to pull off on the loss and damage. Bravo to you, because this is big, and having that as an announceable early on is a massive win, and really gave everybody a lift. So many, many thanks and congrats to my dear brother here. But it now means that the work is hard because we need to raise up and operationalize the loss and damage fund. Get it actually into disbursement mode, which we know is difficult, and we need to do the stock take and all of these hard things. But what we really need to do is to pay attention to what is both underfinanced and underprepared, and that is the adaptation agenda. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Inga, for some of the insights that you've given, that indeed the gap is huge, that even if we double adaptation, we will still not be able to close the gap, but that it's absolutely critical if we don't want to wait for more invoices. I like that. That the cost increases and the invoices will still keep coming. So we need to really close the gap rapidly. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to invite Mr. Simon Steele, the Executive Director of the United Nations Framework Convention, UNFCCC. You're welcome. And this is your copy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. To Inga and your incredible team and all the work that's gone into this, this report, which tells us precisely in very unvarnished terms where we are today. Colleagues, friends, underfinanced, underprepared. The title of this year's Adaptation Gap Report says it all. Calling it a gap now seems to be something of an understatement. A chasm, a gorge, ever widening, kind of sounds more appropriate. This is the sobering reality that confronts us. And yet, adaptation still struggles to compete with mitigation efforts for attention, for prioritization, for funding. Adaptation and mitigation are not an either-or. Both must be equal in their focus, the focus of our attention, and most of all, the focus of our action. Alarmingly, the global stocktake demonstrates that rather than accelerating progress on adaptation, adaptation is stagnating. Colleagues, I am solution-oriented. The bad news is not a reason to despair and slow down. For me, it spurs action. To plug the adaptation gap or chasm, we must address two main issues: policy and finance. We have a real opportunity at this COP, through the global stocktake, to commit to accelerated action across all aspects of the climate agenda, including adaptation. We must agree a new framework for the global goal on adaptation. The goal will allow us to measure our success in addressing climate change impacts that already affect us and also the challenges that lie ahead. Now let's come to the elephant in the room: money. I trust you, like me, wholeheartedly welcome the historic agreement at the beginning of this COP to operationalize the Loss and Damage Fund. An important step, a welcomed addition to the international financial architecture for climate change. But it is no way a replacement for or diminish the urgent need for scaling up adaptation finance. At the risk of oversimplifying, the Loss and Damage Fund will, in part, address the consequences of our failure to adapt. That is an expensive self-goal. Adaptation is about preparedness and strengthening resilience, taking precautions before it's too late. In Glasgow, we agreed to at least double the provision of adaptation finance from 2019 levels by 2025. The new report on doubling adaptation finance, published by the UNEP Standing Committee on Finance last month, does the maths. It estimates that adaptation finance will reach some $40 billion a year by 2025. That's dramatically short of the up to $387 billion developing countries will need every year. Adaptation finance, therefore, needs to be scaled up significantly. Bringing in the private sector, international financial institutions, therefore, need to step up. Funding must be underpinned by access, affordability, and urgency. Countries want grants, not loans. Their foresight initiatives to adapt to climate change must not be punished with further crushing debt. Adaptation is an investment in our future, not an admission of defeat. Let us give it the money and attention it deserves. Let's bridge the gap. It's time to close the chasm. I thank you. Okay, I'll give this one back.
Thank you very much, you very much, Simon, for those remarks, particularly your point that it's really more than a gap, it's a gorge that we need to close. And the fact that the Standing Committee's report talked about a 40 billion financing need by 2025, but actually the report does show that we need much more, especially for developing countries, 387 billion. So thank you very, very much. I would now like to turn to the second segment of this side event. And I'd like to ask the panelists to please join the podium. I welcome Henry Neufeld. Henry is the Chief Scientific Editor of the Adaptation Gap Report and Head of Impact Assessment and Adaptation at UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. Welcome, Henry. I'd like to invite Maria de Pilar. Maria is the AGR, she's the chapter lead for Chapter 1 of the Adaptation Gap Report 2023 on political and scientific context. Welcome, Maria. I'd like to invite Anne Hamil from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. She's the lead author for Chapter 2, Global Progress on Adaptation Planning. Welcome, Anne. I'd like to now invite Timo Letta. Timo works with the Grantham Research Institute of Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics, and is the lead author for Chapter 3, Global Progress on Adaptation, Implementation. Allow me to welcome Peter Pohl. Peter works with Eindhoven University of Technology, and Peter is the lead author of Chapter 4 on Adaptation Finance Gap Update. Last but not least, I'd like to invite Emily Boyd. Emily is with the Lund University, and she's the lead author for Chapter 5 on loss and damage. So welcome, thank you very much. And I'd like to start with Henry. Please do give your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edith. Welcome, honored delegates, guests, friends, colleagues. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present the key findings of the Adaptation Gap Report 2023, Underfinanced, Underprepared. This year saw the hottest summer on record globally by a large margin, and Inga already presented quite a few of the other impacts that we've been seeing this year and in past years, and we all know that these impacts are just going to grow every year as temperature rises. Evidence is clear that climate impacts are rising and are increasingly translating into limits to adaptation, some of which may have already been reached. To protect vulnerable populations and avoid increasing losses and damages, we must urgently ramp up adaptation efforts alongside rapid cuts to greenhouse gas emissions. And we will hear more about that in the next session. In the context of growing climate risks, the Adaptation Gap Reports provide science-based assessments of the global progress in adaptation to inform international climate change discussions under the UN's FCCC. The AGR 2023 shows why adaptation is slowing on all fronts when it should be accelerating to catch up with climate impacts. Yes. As the upper figure shows, progress in adaptation planning is plateauing. While 5 out of 6 countries now have at least one national adaptation planning instrument, progress to reach full global coverage is slowing and requires greater support. On the other hand, over half of countries have 2 or more national level instruments, and their quality is improving in terms of adequacy and effectiveness. The lower figure shows that while projects are getting bigger, that's the red line, the number of adaptation actions supported through the 4 international climate funds has stagnated for the past decade. The report also found that gender and social inclusion is poorly addressed and funded in adaptation actions despite showing better results. Since adaptation implementation in developing countries largely depends on financial support from developed countries, failure to enhance the number of adaptation actions will increase the implementation gap. The Adaptation Gap Report 2023 carried out a major adaptation finance update based on a comprehensive assessment of the literature and new analyses. The figure shows that modeled adaptation costs in this decade are $215 billion per year. Adaptation costs are expected to rise significantly by 2050. Adaptation finance needed to implement domestic adaptation priorities is estimated at $318 billion per year until 2030. In contrast, international public adaptation finance flows to developing countries declined by 15% from 2020 levels to $21 billion in 2021, the latest numbers we have. As a result of growing needs and faltering flows, the current adaptation finance gap is now estimated to be in the range of $194 to $366 billion per year for developing countries alone. Adaptation finance needs are thus 10 to 18 times as great as international public finance flows, much higher than previously estimated. Doubling of 2019 adaptation finance flows by 2025 to about $40 billion per year, as urged in the Glasgow Climate Pact, is therefore more urgent than ever. But on its own, even that can only narrow the adaptation finance gap by 5 to 10%. Effective adaptation significantly reduces climate risks and is good value for money. For example, studies indicate that every billion invested in adaptation against coastal flooding leads to $14 billion in reduced economic damages, and $16 billion invested in agricultural adaptation every year can prevent around 78 million people from suffering from hunger. But finding innovative ways to enhance finance for adaptation is essential to narrow the gap. As the figure shows, this report identifies 7 ways to increase adaptation finance. First, besides doubling of international climate finance by 2025, the new collective quantified goal on climate finance will be instrumental to take the needs of developing countries into account for the period post-2030. Second, mainstreaming adaptation into domestic expenditures and improving budget tagging and tracking can improve policymakers' understanding of the national adaptation finance gap and how it can be narrowed. Third, the public sector must set the right conditions for private investment in adaptation while keeping in mind the overall welfare of society by fixing 3 market imperfections: positive externalities, imperfect financial markets, and incomplete or asymmetric information. Fourth, utilizing remittances from migrants to their home countries, which often contribute significantly to GDP, to address needs that reduce climate risks. Fifth, increasing finance tailored to small and medium-sized enterprises, since they comprise the bulk of the private sector in many developing countries. Sixth, a reform of the global financial architecture, for instance, as proposed by the Bridgetown Initiative, holds vast potentials to support developing countries in boosting their resilience against future climate shocks. And seventh, implementation of Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement on making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low carbon and climate resilient development. As a result of the decision made at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh to establish a fund and funding arrangements for loss and damage, this year's report also specifically focuses on loss and damage to support parties in the negotiations during COP28. A recent study indicates that the 55 most climate vulnerable economies alone have already experienced losses and damages of more than $500 billion in the past 2 decades. These costs will rise steeply in the coming decades, particularly in the absence of strong mitigation and adaptation, which are by far the best ways to limit loss and damage. As the figure shows, the report identifies multiple ways of addressing the residual risks before, during, and after climate change events, and including economic and non-economic loss and damage. But many uncertainties remain regarding the financial needs to address loss and damage, and this requires urgent attention. While the new Loss and Damage Fund will be central to mobilizing resources, other innovative funding sources must be found to reach the necessary scale. Besides grants, insurance, and concessional loans, this includes exploring innovative sources of finance, such as marine shipping levies, aviation levies, taxation, debt relief, debt swaps, and special drawing rights, among others. In conclusion, despite clear signs of rising climate impacts worldwide, adaptation is slowing when it should be accelerating. First, the adaptation finance gap is widening and is much greater than previously estimated. Second, progress in adaptation planning and implementation is plateauing rather than showing the urgently needed acceleration. And third, without strong investment in mitigation and adaptation action worldwide, losses and damages will rise steeply in the coming decades, particularly for the most vulnerable. This will also constrain today's youth and coming generations from shaping a livable future with opportunities for all. COP28 must be the moment the world commits fully to insulating low-income countries and disadvantaged groups such as women and indigenous peoples from climate impacts. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry, for that presentation. And I think if you listened to the 2 speakers, the high-level speakers, and also seen the presentation from Henry, it's very clear that we have a lot to worry about, that the adaptation progress is plateauing, it's slow, the gap is widening in terms of the finance gap, and a lot needs to be done, that instead of accelerating adaptation, it's actually slowing down. So a lot needs to be done. With that, I'd like to now turn to the panelists. These are chapter authors, for us to have a bit of an engagement with our authors to get more in-depth into the report. I'd like to start with Maria De Pilar. In your chapter, you've indicated that there are 3 main challenges for adaptation and loss and damage that needs to be addressed at COP28. Could you please outline what these challenges are, what has been achieved so far, and how might this report influence this? Please elaborate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edith. Yes, indeed, one of the main challenges identified in Chapter 1 is on adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation and support. On this regard, the Adaptation Gap Report expressed that these are cornerstones, these concepts are cornerstones, not only in the adaptation architecture at the UNFCCC, but also in terms of the literature, even though in both spaces they need more development. At the same time, the Adaptation Gap Report elaborates more in terms of whether policy instruments and support are really matching the adaptation needs, as well as at some point are reducing the risks related. These adequacy and effectiveness are also part of adaptation in the GST. And we can find these very important concepts as part of the Adaptation Gap Report in different chapters, including on planning, implementation, and others. With respect to the second challenge, that is on loss and damage fund and funding arrangements, the Chapter 1 expressed that increasing adaptation risks and adaptation limits and residual risks are really decreasing adaptive capacities, and at the same time are increasing the need in order to really address those impacts that are beyond a system adaptation potential. So one of the key messages provided by this chapter is the need to separate in a very clear way adaptation finance from loss and damage finance. The third challenge identified in this chapter is on the global goal on adaptation and the GST. With respect to the global goal on adaptation, it raises that is quite critical in COP28 to really launch an ambitious framework on the global goal, including targets and metrics that really can help us to strengthen local, national, and transboundary measures, and at the same time planning and implementation, including assessing progress at the collective level, but at the same time using the existing communication and reporting system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think what stood out is the need to separate adaptation finance from loss and damage finance, especially given that there's residual risk that the loss and damage fund would need to address. I'd like to now hand over to Anne. Anne, you focused on the adaptation planning. And in your report, in your chapter, you indicate that 1 in 6 countries do not have a national planning instrument. What are the main barriers, and what can be done to overcome this?
Sure. Thanks, Edith. Yeah, so this year we found that about, as we heard in Inger's comments, that 85% of the world's countries have at least one adaptation planning instrument in place, so a policy, a strategy, a plan. And so I think naturally as these types of trends evolve, it becomes a bit harder to sort of reach 100%. You're sort of reaching a saturation point. So naturally the rate of uptake of these instruments is going to be slowing. And so we definitely did find that trend this year, that there was only a 2% increase, I think 4 countries that have a first adaptation planning instrument in place. And so that leaves a group of countries, I think about 29 countries, that don't have an adaptation planning instrument. Now, half of them, there's evidence that they have a planning instrument currently being developed. And so an optimistic view is that within the next couple of years, we can comfortably say that 92% of the world is going to be covered by at least one planning instrument. But that still does leave a group of countries, about 15 countries, that there isn't any evidence of a planning instrument being developed. And when you look at this list of countries, at least half of them are fragile, conflict-affected countries. And so we've heard already at this COP, I think on the Peace Day a couple of days ago, that these types of countries, these groups of countries really do require special attention. And when you're looking at trends that what we heard of in finance, this is especially worrying because we already know that the fragile countries are only receiving a fraction of the climate finance that's needed. They're only receiving a fraction of the type of support, whether it's technical, institutional, that's really needed as well. And those are really the big barriers when you think about adaptation planning being a massive sort of institutional strengthening exercise in governance. This kind of support is absolutely critical. And it's not just volume of support as well, it's the type of support that these countries receive as well, the quality, more flexible, long-term. And so these are the types of considerations that need to be put in place if we really want to see the 100% coverage that we're after on planning.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think what was striking is that the majority of those countries that do not have a planning instrument are actually conflict-affected countries.
About half.
So that's, yeah, most of them. Okay, great. So it's one thing to plan, and it's another to implement. So I'd like to move to Timo. Timo, could you tell us in your chapter, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from the implementation chapter? especially given that your analysis also looked at the adaptation communication from countries, and how can those lessons inform the global stocktake and also the global goal on adaptation?
Great, thank you, Edith, and thank you very much. So the implementation chapter faces the challenge of understanding, implementation. And so there isn't a single indicator or data source. What the chapter is doing is we're using different and multiple data sources and combining them to get like a puzzle or a better overview of the implementation of adaptation worldwide. So one of the key data sources that we are using is the projects that are being funded by the Adaptation Fund, the GCF, and the Global Environment Facility. This is one part. This is what Henry showed in the presentation. And then adaptation communications are this new communication tool under the Paris Agreement. So countries are encouraged to submit adaptation communications. And as of August this year, 40 countries have done so. So they've submitted a standalone new document informing about adaptation needs, vulnerabilities, and implementation. So what we did in addition as a new component in this year's implementation chapter is we analyzed in detail the implementation part of those 40 adaptation communications. And they are from developing countries and from developed countries. What we found was there was a great variety in the level of detail across these adaptation communications. In total, we found over 1,100 adaptation actions being mentioned. And for around half of them, there were details provided that we could analyze. So the top sectors were agriculture, water, and biodiversity. And so what we are looking for was new information about domestic implementation, because we have the databases from the global climate funds that we can access, but what we're lacking is information about what countries also themselves fund domestically and what happens on the ground in communities. And we were hoping that we will get a better view about that through the adaptation communications, which to some extent is there. But there's still more that we would like to have under the global stocktake to understand the breadth and depth of adaptation implementation. So, and that's the potential that adaptation communications have, but it's also important to keep in mind that countries starting by end of this year are supposed to have transparency reports, and then the question is what information to put into transparency reports and what information to put into adaptation communications. But in conclusion, so we hope that through this additional information that countries are providing, we will be better able to understand adaptation implementation and adding another piece of the puzzle to the implementation picture. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think a lot needs to be done. I'd now like to move to finance. It was quite shocking to see the large finance gap, adaptation finance gap. The question to you is, what are the available options for reducing and closing this gap? And how can COP28 support that?
Yes, thank you very much, Edith. This year we did a full new assessment of the adaptation costs and the adaptation finance gap, the first one since 2016. And indeed, the numbers show that the financing gap is actually increasing. And I'd like to make 5 points there, actually, all within 2 minutes. So stay put. The first one is, I think the fact that this gap is increasing despite the fact that adaptation is often cheaper than waiting for the impacts that lie ahead of us if we don't adapt, and the fact that the people that are most impacted by climate change have least responsibility for causing it, actually, both show that this financing gap is kind of a symptom for a financial system that is failing on us. Right, so we have to look beyond just how do you mobilize more billions, but we have to look at the financial system as a whole. The second point I wanted to make is that this shouldn't be such a surprise, because both public and private priorities are still on the wrong place. In this bubble here, we tend to believe that the 650 million that is now pledged, or around 650 million, to this loss and damage fund is great, and I agree it is great. But it's about the same amount that the 9 top players in the Saudi Arabia Football League are getting paid on an annual level. So that kind of indicates where our priorities are, right? And that's just the Saudi Arabia Football League. The third point is that, yes, international public adaptation finance is crucial if we want to close this gap. It's absolutely crucial. At the same time, even if we were able to manage it to increase it to 40 billion by 2025, as was basically agreed in Glasgow, that will only close, as Henry also mentioned, 5 to 10% of the adaptation finance gap, right? So we have to realize that international public adaptation finance will never be able to close the adaptation finance gap. And that's a harsh message for some, but it's a reality, I think, that we should take into account. The fourth point is, and the fourth and the fifth actually, is, okay, so how do we now close this gap? What are the options that we have? And Henry already showed the picture with this onion that we have in the report. I think there's 2 points I want to highlight here. The first one is remittances. These continue to increase and now amount more than 700 billion per year. So there's a massive amount of money that migrant workers send home to their families, sometimes to their friends, and we think that these could be used for adaptation. In fact, they already help a lot of people to increase their resilience. So we could look into that. The issue, though, is that you basically ask the poorest people that have often caused least climate change to use their funding to adapt. So there's an equity issue there that is very important. And then the final point is Article 2.1c. We have to get real about this. Actually, we had another event yesterday where a lot of people from the financial sector are already saying that they are starting to integrate physical climate risks into their investment decision making. So this is happening. This train is catching speed, and I think this is crucial to actually both move private investments away from things that actually increase or reduce resilience for people, right, by infrastructure in vulnerable areas, for example, and shift it towards ways in which it can actually support adaptation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for those concrete ways in which we could close the gap. I'd now like to quickly move to Emily. Emily, it's good to see that the Adaptation Gap report focused on loss and damage. Could you elaborate to what extent this report can inform the negotiations on loss and damage? Just 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. 2 minutes. I will just say that thank you very much for the previous words. It was very exciting to see that loss and damage was in the Adaptation Gap report this year. I think it was very timely, and that sort of addresses your question in that it's very clear that whilst we have to continue to decarbonize and invest in adaptation, in particular reducing risk and building resilience, which is what adaptation is about, there is this aspect which is the unequal effects of climate change that are being experienced, and that is where the addressing comes in. And I think the report, in its timeliness, probably has an influence in terms of perhaps not the scale of funding, as you point out. You know, it's fantastic to see the pledges here, and it's fantastic to see something starting, but overall the funds are probably quite insufficient. However, it's also, as the chapter points out, pointing to an understanding of what loss and damage is. What is it to address loss and damage? It's a justice aspect to the effects of climate change, but it's also about the economic impacts and the non-economic impacts as well, and the kinds of actions that we need to think about and develop. So even if that funding is small, it's an intention. It's starting to get us to think, what kinds of ways do we need to think beyond adaptation as well, also in hand with adaptation, loss and damage, because loss and damage should not be a subsidy for adaptation mitigation, but a complementary. And also, it allows us to think about how we use finance and how we relate to the financial structures and reforming of finance. So I think, overall, having this chapter in the report is a fantastic timing. I think they've done a really good job in inviting it in, those who planned this. And I also think it has an impact on the negotiations, because I see that negotiators cite the report all the time. So there is a direct link here between the scientific understanding, the methodologies that colleagues are using here, the monitoring of how things are going, and then that feeds into evidence-based informed decisions that are going on in the COP.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And your point that it's like two sides of the same coin, and that we should be looking at supporting both and not one subsidizing the other. Thank you very much. I see we have a very short time left. I'd like to only give one person a chance to ask a question. Who's the bold one? Any question to the panelists? Please go ahead. Is there a roving mic? She's right here in front on the left. Yeah.
Hello. I'll try my best to,
Please just introduce yourself
Hi,
and your affiliation and go straight to your question.
So hi, this is Durre Mahmood. I'm representing Oxford Policy Management here, and I'm from Pakistan. So my question is that we recently did an ocean action review for Commonwealth Blue Charter, and in that we looked at bluing of NDCs, and we realized that some of the thematic areas are actually mentioned in the national adaptation plans of these countries that we are talking about, but there was a lack of alignment between the NDCs and NAP, and some of the adaptation actions are actually highlighted in the NDCs as well, but they're not like sort of aligned, with. So did you come across something like this? Because there are different priorities, actions, and then countries have their own strategic policies, but they're not aligned. There's a lack of coordination. So does this report covers that bit as well? Just wanted to check that. Thank you.
So who will take the question? You will. Sure. Okay, go ahead.
So maybe 2 points on methodology. The first one is that our review of national planning instruments, adaptation planning instruments, doesn't include NDCs. But we are aware that adaptation sections are in NDCs, of course, and the NDCs were reviewed to look at adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation planning. So I can talk to you afterwards about why those decisions were made. But to your point about misalignment, we are definitely seeing that. So, IISD hosts a secretariat for something called the NAP Global Network. And so our focus is on NAPs, and of course we have to look at NDCs, and oftentimes we will find that they're saying different things, articulating different priorities. And I think this is a symptom of maybe each of the instruments being developed in different parts of government. It can also be that a NAP might have been produced over 5 years ago, and so countries want to update what's in there, and they find developing their NDC provides a vehicle for doing that. But I do agree with you that it's a priority to have these aligned, because one of the main questions that we're constantly getting from potentially interested funders when they go into, they're engaging with countries is, we don't know what to look at. We're hearing different things from different parts of government. And so really sort of having that sort of one point of clarification and articulation of priorities is critically important. So I agree with you. It's a problem, but hopefully it's becoming resolved, though. So.
Oh. Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to close it there, since we have to give way to the next session, unless somebody wanted to give a quick overview. Oh yeah, sure, go ahead.
Very quickly, if I can also answer to the question. So in the 2020 implementation chapter, so every year we're doing something different in the chapter. We checked the alignment of NDCs to the adaptation project from the Adaptation Fund, the GCF and the GEF, and we found good alignment in terms of the climate hazards being addressed and the sectoral priorities. So if you look at the 2020 implementation chapter, you'll find the diagram of this. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Please do join me in really congratulating the panel. That was fantastic. I'd just like to mention 3 things that stood out for me. One is that adaptation progress is slowing. 2, planning and implementation is plateauing. We've seen the financing gap is really huge, and even doubling adaptation is not good enough. More needs to be done. And the report was very clear on what can be done, provided 7 areas in which we could close the adaptation finance gap. Finally, I think on adaptation versus loss and damage, it's very clear that they need to be complementary, and that we need, while we can look at justice issues, we also need to look at both economic and non-economic impacts of loss and damage. So thank you very much for taking your time to join us. I'd like to mention that after this session, we have the mitigation gap report session, which is starting right after this. So please do join us if you have time. Thank you very much, and do have a good day.
channel. This is the floor 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 channel.